very much for inviting me to speak today. I thought what I might do, when I was thinking about this, I was asked to sort of speak, and my thought was, one, what topic, and then secondly, sort of how to approach that topic. This idea, this discussion about extremes of wealth and poverty has been something that, ever since I became a Baha'i 15 years ago, kind of have maybe grappled with to some degree and tried to come to understand a little bit better. So what I thought I might do is just kind of take you on the journey that I went through over the last maybe 15 years of my sort of understanding and relationship with wealth and poverty and kind of what it looks like. Mainly because I have to say, before I became a Baha'i, my thinking on the subject, the concept of wealth, was what I would term more as sort of an old world relationship with wealth. That sort of idea that wealth was an end in and of itself. To have the biggest whatever, to have the most money or the most distinction by whatever. And that was sort of the metric by which I sort of thought one succeeded and judged oneself. And so when I became a Baha'i, I started to look a little bit more into the writings about kind of this topic and the concept of it. And obviously the Baha'i writings have a lot. You've heard a good bit this morning about what the Baha'i faith has to say about it. And I thought I might take a few of those topics and just kind of delve into those a little bit deeper. The other thing I thought, the reason I think this is also important is, many of you may know, this topic, this concept of extremes of wealth and poverty, what occurs at the extremes of wealth, has become a very hot button topic right now. So this year, 2014, marks the 50th anniversary of when Lyndon B. Johnson gave his State of the Union address and spoke about the war on poverty and how we wanted to combat that. But also, just very recently, closer to home, with the Great Recession that just happened, many people have been thinking about and talking about what caused that phenomenon, this Occupy Wall Street movement, the We Are the 99% movement, just thinking about what's happening with wealth, how is it being distributed, and what is our relationship with it, and what is the purpose of it. And also, I think it's important, at least for myself, and hopefully for those of you in the audience, to understand what do the Baha'i writings have to say about this topic, so that as we engage with our friends, our family, our neighbors, and our co-workers, we have an understanding based on what Baha'u'llah has revealed for the Baha'is about how we engage on this topic and engage with our friends and family and those around us. Because it does have, I think, a lot to do with how we interact with our colleagues or co-religionists, and to have some understanding of what the Baha'i faith has to say about these things. Also, although it seems, I think, maybe a little bit on the surface different than what we've been talking about over the last few Sundays, as far as our spiritual ancestry and Martin Luther King and elimination of prejudice. On the one hand, on the surface, it might seem like that, but as I've come to learn over the many years studying the Baha'i writings, most of these things have either direct or indirect links, and they can't all tie together at a more deeper level. So while I'm going to speak specifically about this subject, I think it clearly has to do with ideas of elimination of prejudice of all kinds, so race and class, but also ideas about universal education, the equality of men and women. These things are not necessarily separate topics to this. They all play a role. So I'm probably doing the topic injustice by just talking about this, but I encourage you all to kind of look at some of the data that I'm going to present and some of the references I'll give to just see how they all do tie together. So the first thing I thought I'd do is I have a few slides. I just kind of wanted to set the stage because I think many people have their own opinions about what things are, but it's interesting just to look at the facts about how they really are, so that we all can speak from sort of the same viewpoint. So the first slide that I have up here is data from the Congressional Budget Office about the percent change in after-tax income since 1979, so the last 35 years, of what's happened to different segments of the population. So this top line, the red line, is the top 1% of people from 1979 to now, or 2007 I should say, have seen their after-tax income increase by 281%. well beyond inflation, well beyond what most people would say is anything that's going to lead them into poverty. The yellow line is the highest fifth, and this bottom blue line here is the bottom fifth of the population based on their after-tax income, and they've seen it rise only about 16%. They barely keeping up with things like inflation and cost of living adjustments and those kinds of things. If we can do the next slide. That was the US, this is the world. So if you look at, this is data from 2012, Credit Suisse's Global Wealth Data Book. What it shows, if you look at it, I'm sorry, the numbers are kind of small, the top little part of the pyramid represents 29 million people, 0.6% of the world's population, who control and have at their disposal greater than the equivalent of greater than $1 million US, and that makes up about 40% of the world's wealth. The bottom, darker green or whatever area you might say there, represents about 3.2 billion people who have a cumulative wealth less than US $10,000, and they make up about 3.3% of the world's wealth, about $7 trillion. Recently, and I'll reference it later, the Oxfam organization provided a report to a conference that's going on currently in Davos, Switzerland, the World Economic Forum. And this, maybe you've heard this number been thrown around recently on radio reports. So the 85 richest people in the world have the equivalent wealth of the 3.5 billion poorest people in the world, as far as distribution of wealth. So just interesting statistics to be aware of as we think about those kinds of things. And then the last one, if we can do the next slide. This is an interesting study I saw, which sort of talks about perceptions of wealth. So this is a couple of researchers took 5,000 Americans and asked them their concepts of wealth. The top bar is the actual distribution of wealth, where you can see that large yellow part is the top 20th percent who control about 85% of the wealth. And when we talk about wealth, I'm talking about what I also thought about as wealth, things like money, resources, right? So gold and diamonds and whatever, oil, food, shelter, access to healthcare, things that are necessary for people to live comfortably. That's what we're talking about when we talk about wealth here. So the top is the actual distribution, and you can see the bottom 20th percentile barely makes the cut, and they have a very small wedge of that. The middle bar, when they surveyed these folks, 5,000 people from all gamuts of life, right? So rich, poor, right wing, left wing, whatever they were, they just all were in that group. They all thought it was much more equitable than it is. But when you asked them, would you like it to be different, they actually wanted it more equitable than what they thought it was and what it actually is. So if you ask people from all aspects of life, they actually want a more even distribution of wealth, which is kind of interesting to think about it. So people want this. Why aren't we achieving it? As I showed in that first graph, things have gotten worse over time, and study after study confirms that that's the case. And before I move on, what I want to do is I want to be careful not to necessarily make wealth seem as a negative thing. The analogy I've given, I've kind of mentioned this to some friends of mine, so forgive me if I sound like a broken record, but I think of wealth now, whereas before I had one aspect or view of it, less like a good or a bad thing inherently. It is what it is, and it's our relationship with it and how we utilize it that we understand, what is the purpose of wealth. Like fire, a fire when it's self-contained can warm a house, can cook food, it can provide lots of beneficial things, but left unchecked, it can burn down homes, start forest fires, and all of these other kinds of things. So wealth probably, I would say, has a similar analogy to it, is how is it utilized and what is it utilized for? So what I want to do now is, as I started studying the writings, I found a lot of very interesting things, and what I want to talk about is what the writings have to say about wealth, and just kind of show you what I've gone through in my evolution and understanding. So Abdu'l-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, has a few things to say about wealth, which I think are very important as we think about it and as we engage in conversation. He says that wealth is praiseworthy in the highest degree if it is acquired by an individual's own efforts and grace of God, in commerce, agriculture, art, and industry, and if it be expended for philanthropic purposes. So wealth already now is not something that's necessarily negative. He says it's commendable. It's to the highest degree it's commendable if it's acquired in such a way through this type of meaningful work, and it's expended in such a way. So we have a sort of a condition upon which that wealth can be helpful to humanity. He says wealth is most commendable provided the entire population is wealthy. So that kind of fits along with what the population wants. Abdu'l-Baha said this years ago. He said, it's most commendable as long as the entire population is wealthy. If, however, a few have inordinate riches, while the rest are impoverished, and no fruit or benefit accrues from that wealth, here's the warning, then it is only a liability to its possessor. So you can have all of this stuff. It's sort of like that unchecked fire. It's kind of, it can harm you. If, on the other hand, it is expended for the promotion of knowledge, the founding of elementary and other schools, the encouragement of art and industry, the training of orphans and the poor, in brief, if it is dedicated to the welfare of society, its possessor will stand out before God and man as the most excellent of all who live on earth and will be accounted as one of the people of paradise. So it reminds me of the song you just sang, Another Day in Paradise. How is our relationship with this wealth, and what are we utilizing it for? And I think as I've kind of understood this a little bit more, I'm drawn to think about how do we utilize wealth. Recently at this World Economic Conference in Switzerland, Pope Francis, so this is not just a Baha'i concept, he had a statement and gave it to the leaders, economic and political leaders that are gathered there. And he says here in a statement, I just have this was in this week's Time magazine, he says, I ask you to ensure that humanity is served by wealth and not ruled by it. So this is, again, something that we're all coming to understand about what is the purpose of wealth. Moreover, Abdu'l-Baha says that how do Baha'is sort of enact this process? And he gives us actually, I think, the early glimpse of what we need to be doing and how we need to be thinking about it. So he says, each one of you must have great consideration for the poor and render them assistance. Organize in an effort to help them and prevent increase in poverty. The greatest means for prevention of the increase in poverty is that whereby the laws of the community will be so framed and enacted that it will not be possible for a few to be millionaires and many destitute. So it's very interesting. He's actually giving us some pretty direct guidance there about what we need to be thinking about. We need to be, not necessarily in a partisan political way, but be thinking about how our laws enacted and enforced such that it is actually impossible for a few to become wealthy, to keep this from happening. So when we think about that, when we engage in conversation with our friends and family, we have direct writings which talk about that idea and that concept, at least to me, as I understand it. One of Baha'u'llah's teachings, he says, is the adjustment of the means of livelihood in human society. Under this adjustment, there can be no extremes in human conditions as regards wealth and sustenance. So it's not just simply wealth, but it's food, water, these kinds of things. If we can show the next slide, I think this is an interesting slide. On the top 4 lines, this is from a book that a Baha'i physician, a psychiatrist in Canada has put together on materialism. I think it's quite interesting where he's taken some data. It's a newer book, but this is data from 1998. And what he's shown is that the top 4 lines is basically the funds necessary in US dollars in billions for 1 year to provide, and I'm sorry it's so small, basic education for all in developing countries, water and sanitation for all in developing countries, reproductive health for women in developing countries, and basic health and nutrition. So just things that most of us sort of take for granted. All of that would cost $40 billion in 1998. A lot of money for most people. But where might that come from? If you look at the bottom lines, this is what we in the developed world utilize. So just for example, in the US, cosmetics alone in 1 year we spend $8 billion on. In the in Europe, ice cream we spend $11 billion on. You know, you can go on and on. Military spending is obviously one of the largest spendings that we do, and I don't know if everybody can see that, $780 billion per year. If we, in the US and Europe, just decided we didn't want to feed our pets for a year, not use perfume, and not eat ice cream, we could take care of basic sustenance for the developing world for 1 year. It's just an interesting concept to think about. And I think about this, and then I'm drawn to the countless stories of Abdu'l-Baha. When he was given anything of value, he pretty much turned around, tried to sell it, and give to everybody else. So, just some sobering facts. Sorry. Emotional to talk about Abdu'l-Baha. And this is where I think we think about how we transition from this concept of wealth, as I understood it, sort of goods, resources, whatever you want to call it, to something that's tied more spiritually. So Abdu'l-Baha says, when he was traveling in the US, he says, the fundamentals of the whole economic condition are divine in nature and are associated with the world of the heart and spirit. It's interesting. I was listening two nights ago, or maybe it was last night, to a radio program on NPR called On Point or To the Point or something like that. They were interviewing, again, as I said, this topic is a very hot topic, so they were interviewing several people who were reviewing this Oxfam report that just came out, and they had on the program a guy who used to be on Wall Street. He was a trader. It was interesting. He was talking about his life and how he kind of changed. He went to the best schools, was a Wall Street trader, and he said, I could have gotten any seats I wanted to a World Series game. I could have gone to the fanciest restaurants, seen the best shows, and been part of whatever. But he quickly came out of that process and had a lot of self-reflection about what he was doing. And he commented, he said, when I was young, I had this sort of addiction to food. I became very overweight. I was using that as a substitute for something. And then for a while, I got addicted to alcohol and drugs, and I got stuck on this process. And then I went on to Wall Street, and I got addicted to money, and I was making all this money and all these kinds of things. And finally, he understood that none of that was providing him satisfaction. So the quote, I think, Laura read, "Oh, quintessence of passion, put away all covetousness and seek contentment." He went back. Now what he does, actually, is he runs a program called Food Ships or something like that, where he provides and has supplemental programs to have people who have no access to food be able to get healthy food for themselves because of his battle with obesity. But what's interesting is when you listen to him talk, he was saying that, he said, I think no less than 3 or 4 times, what he was doing is trying to, with all those addictions he had, he was trying to fill a spiritual void. Which is interesting when Abdu'l-Baha says that the whole economic condition is associated with the world of the heart and the spirit. So it's not that these things are separate. They are somehow entwined, and we have to come to understand those a little bit better. He says the Baha'is will bring about this improvement and betterment, not through sedition and appeal to physical force, and not through warfare, but through welfare. Hearts must be so cemented together, love must become so dominant, that the rich shall most willingly extend assistance to the poor and take steps to establish these economic adjustments permanently. So again, speaking about how we're enacting laws and enforcing laws that allow for this to happen. He says, for example, it will be as if the rich inhabitants of a city should say, it is neither just nor lawful that we should possess great wealth while there is abject poverty in this community, and then willingly give their wealth to the poor, retaining only as much as will enable them to live comfortably. So it's not to give everything and then make yourself destitute. The point is so that wealth is important and commendable such that everyone is wealthy. I'll end just because I don't want to go over too much, but I think what has happened as I've understood this concept and understanding of wealth is a more spiritual understanding of what wealth is. And I think the quote, one was read by Laura, and I'll leave with my last quote, of exactly what is wealth. And I'll just delve into the one that Laura read. It says, "O son of man," this is from Baha'u'llah, and this is from the Hidden Words. For friends who are not Baha'is, this is essentially what we feel God is telling humanity, right? So he says, "O son of man," speaking to humanity, "thou dost wish for gold, and I desire thy freedom from it." And I would say, in this sense, gold is that material wealth that we think about, the riches that we speak of. Thou thinkest thyself rich in its possession, and I recognize thy wealth and thy sanctity therefrom. So here he's turned wealth completely on its head. It's no longer the possession of all those things. It's actually the sanctity from those things. And then I think this is probably the one that sort of hits me the hardest as far as understanding what wealth is. Baha'u'llah, in one of his tablets to humanity, he says, the essence of wealth is love for me. So it's no longer even dependent on anything material. It's just love for God. Which means that anyone, whether they have perfumes and dogs or whatever, has wealth because of love for God. Whoso loveth me is the possessor of all things, and he that loveth me not is indeed of the poor and needy. This is that which the finger of glory and splendor hath revealed. So I think that to me sort of helps me understand, has kind of moved my understanding or evolved my understanding of what material wealth is to a more spiritual understanding, and not necessarily to chastise wealth as something bad or good, but a tool by which we improve and better society and humanity. I'll just put up the last slide, which is just some of the references that I looked at. If anybody's interested, they're welcome to show the last one. But many of these texts have a lot of interesting. The first is a report that just came out last week about just a lot of the inequities that are there. The second is a book by a Baha'i who lives in Canada. He's a psychiatrist who just talks a lot about the moral and social consequences, and I think it's a great exploration of how it's not just about wealth, but how it deals with things like the treatment of young women, prejudice, a lot of these other things. They're all intertwined, and he does a great job of sort of weaving that all together. And the last is sort of 3 documents that have been quite helpful for me in studying this, put out by the Baha'i International Community on just the understanding of what is prosperity, rethinking the concept of prosperity. So that's it. Thank you.